Hi Yuri, and welcome to the Carlton Academy's lesson about recruitment in World War One. Now you should have already completed a starter activity with your teacher as part of your team's live introduction, so let's make start on the lesson. And remember, you need to pause this video when I ask you to so that you can complete the tasks. And also don't forget that your teacher will be on Teams for the entire lesson if you need to ask any questions. First of all, could you write down today's title, which is How Were Men Recruited to the Army in 1914? Today's lesson will be looking at the different methods of how people were recruited into the army in World War One, and we're also going to be making a judgment today about how effective these methods were, and also deciding which of these methods was the most effective. So you might want to pause this slide here whilst you write down today's title. Now you don't need to write anything down for this task, this is just something for you to think about. I'd like to take a look at this picture that was taken outside of Buckingham Palace when the war was announced in 1914. And I want you to stop and think for yourselves. How have the people reacted in this picture? I'd like to pause the video and just have a really good look and think about how the people are reacting at this point. Okay, so some of the things that you might have noticed is that people, of course, have gathered in a huge crowd outside of Buckingham Palace, which suggests that they might be celebrating. Are they angry? Are they rebelling against the announcement of the war? But actually, I think it's important that we recognise the emotions that are being shared amongst the people. People seem to be waving their hats. It almost looks as if they are cheering and, celebrating in some way. What might this tell us about the British people's attitude towards the outbreak of war when it happened? Does it suggest that they were excited about it, or does it suggest that they were angry about the declaration of war on Germany? Have a little think about that for yourselves before we get started on today's lesson. So today's lesson is all about recruitment in World War One, but before we start looking at recruitment itself, we need to start by understanding what position Britain was in at the beginning of the war. So in August 1914, when the First World War first broke out, Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, realised that Britain needed a bigger army. At this stage, Britain's army was in no fit state to compare against the German army, which at this stage basically was about 2.2 million men strong with 6 million reserves. So they had a really large army and we had nothing in comparison. So essentially, Britain needed to expand its army, and this was to be done through a number of different measures. And it was largely about encouraging men to sign up voluntarily. So first of all, we know that Lord Kitchener sent out a direct appeal to the men of Britain, asking them to sign up. Now you can see this in the poster on the left, where you can see Kitchener pointing his finger at anybody passing by, telling them that their country needs them. At this time, many men did feel quite proud to fight for their country. There was a real sense of patriotism and nationalism at this time, which meant that some men did feel quite passionate about supporting this appeal. However, for those that need a little bit of persuasion, there were a lot of things in place. For example, 54 million posters were issued encouraging men to sign up voluntarily. Now, this is something we're going to be exploring a little bit more in today's lesson. 8 million letters were also sent out. 12,000 meetings were held, and 20,000 speeches were given by military spokesmen. These things, combined with many other ways of encouraging men to sign up, were quite successful. In the first weekend of the war, 100 men an hour signed up to join the armed forces. That's 3,000 men a day. And by the end of 1914, 1,186,337 men had enlisted to fight in World War I. Now, these men were signing up voluntarily. They didn't have to join. It wasn't until 1916 when basically people had to join because of conscription, which is basically where the government enforced men to sign up. It wasn't voluntary anymore. But up until that point, men could join up. But it's important we recognise throughout this lesson what the consequences might be if they didn't join, and what the different measures were that were set in place to make men think that they had to join. And that's what we're going to be looking at over this lesson. Okay, so throughout this lesson, we're going to be looking at the different measures that the government put into place to try and encourage more men to sign up for the war. But what I wanted to look at first of all is why some men would actually want to join the army anyway at this time, why some men felt the need to do that. So what I'd like us to do is to make a spider diagram into your books or on your piece of paper, just demonstrating the different reasons why men joined the army. There are a number of ones around your spider diagram that's on this slide. You just need to copy them down on your piece of paper. I'm going to read through them with you, and you can start writing them down now. So the first one is patriotism. I've already talked about this. It's the desire to fight for your country and the feeling that you want to protect your country. Social pressure, giving white feathers, accusing men of being cowards. I'm going to be talking about that a lot more today, so I'm not going to dwell on that too much now. But basically, there was a strong social pressure that made men feel that they were cowards if they did not go and fight. The third one is a sense of adventure. Some men at this particular time had never travelled outside their village or their town. So for some people, this was a sense of adventure. It was about going to France, going to a new country and seeing something different. That was something that would be quite exciting to people, perhaps before they arrived there. The next one is that the war would be over by Christmas. Many believed that this was not going to take 4 long years. Many hoped that actually this would be a very quick victory and everybody would be back home with their families by Christmas. The next one is propaganda. Again, we're going to be talking a lot more about this today, but some men definitely would have joined the army because they felt pressured by propaganda. That means posters and leaflets encouraging men to feel a particular way. And the final one is hatred for the Germans. Some men actually believed in what they were fighting for. Some men felt the Germans had done some wrong and that needed to be set right by Britain fighting against the German army. So ultimately, there are 6 different reasons there as to why some men may have joined the army. But we're going to be looking further at this as we talk about how the government encouraged men to feel perhaps this way. Pause the slide here so you can make sure you've got these points down before we move on. So as I mentioned earlier in the lesson, we're going to spend this next task basically looking at the different tactics used by the government to encourage more men to join the military voluntarily. You're going to be needing to make notes over these next few slides, so make sure that you are using subheadings to keep your notes organised. I will tell you when you need to write a new subheading, and remember that you'll need to be writing your notes as bullet points, just short, quick facts that you think are important about each different section. Again, I will be highlighting some of the important things with you, so I hope that will help you to know what the kind of things you need to pick out and write down. Okay, great. So our first section and your first subheading needs to be recruitment posters. So as I talk through this information, what I'd like you to be doing is listening carefully and making some notes about how recruitment posters encouraged men to sign up to fight in World War I. So I'm going to read through each of the bullet points, and I might extend some of the information with my own knowledge, but it's important that you make sure that you're perhaps just writing down the bits that you think are really important. So, in terms of the first bullet point, I've stated that what the public thought about the war really mattered. This wasn't just about recruitment. The government basically created loads of propaganda posters, not just about recruitment, but basically encouraging people to feel a certain way about the war. And when it came to recruitment, that feeling was pride. It was about making people feel proud to go to war and actually ashamed if they didn't. And we're going to see some examples of that, particularly on the next slide. But there are some that you can see on the right-hand side at the moment. For example, this one here that says "Women of Britain say go," suggesting that there is this issue where women will be ashamed of men if perhaps they don't go, and it's encouraging men to join because essentially it might be about protecting the women and the children that are still living in the country. So again, there'd be a kind of a sense of duty there, and it's being again kind of portrayed through this picture of women encouraging men to sign up. Now, the government needed to recruit loads of soldiers, as we know. And so they needed people to support them in this campaign. And that's why these propaganda posters were put into place, to try and encourage men to sign up. So it's important that you do write down that the government needed to recruit lots of soldiers. And so that's why these propaganda posters were created. Posters were printed to make the army look exciting. This is really important. They wouldn't, of course, have included in their propaganda posters the problems with war. They wouldn't have actually shown people what the trenches were like and what the conditions were like when you got there. They wouldn't have shown the casualties and, the horror of the machine gun that people were having to face once they got to war. They wouldn't have shown some of the injuries that people had faced. They wouldn't show those stuff. They would only show the positive pictures of war. They'd make the army look exciting, like it was a place to go with your friends, and it was a place for you to become a hero. Other posters, of course, told men that it was their duty to join. So rather than just making it look excited, they also told men that they would be proud if they did sign up, and they would be embarrassed if they didn't. They would feel guilty for not protecting the people in England. So it's about making men feel like there was a duty and that they had to do it. These posters, as we've already mentioned, are an example of propaganda. Now, propaganda is where you basically want to make people think in a certain way. And so these propaganda posters were all one-sided. They were all about making men see the same sort of message. It's not like you saw other propaganda posters being published by the government, which showed the reality of war, as we've just discussed. It was all about the positives that you would feel if you did sign up. Posters were also carefully designed with words and images, and they had a special effect on the viewer. Quite often what you will see, particularly when it comes to words, is you'll see words in capitals or underlined, like you can see in these posters here. It's about being eye-catching, standing out, and speaking directly to the viewer. Quite often the posters will use the word you and make it stand out. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to question the viewer. Are you signed up? Where are you in this war? And making it look as if everybody else has signed up and you're the only one. And again, it's about kind of encouraging people to feel the shame in that. We're going to go on to the next slide and look at some examples of these propaganda posters. So here are 3 recruitment posters from World War I. I would like you as your task to write down what the message is in each one of them. Let's have a look at the first one together. Now this first picture shows a man sat with his 2 children. He's got a daughter and a son. His son is sat playing with some military toys, so some little soldiers. His daughter is sat reading a book. Now the significance of this is suggesting that his son perhaps sees soldiers in a positive light. Perhaps he sees them as quite brave. Maybe it's something he looks up to become when he's older. His daughter is sat reading a book and she's pointing to the book as she says these words. Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? Now perhaps that suggests that this book is telling this young girl about the war. Maybe it's a history book and it's telling her about what happened during the Great War and Britain's successes in the future. This picture is supposed to represent what the future will be like for this man. Now he might be a young man at the time of the war, but he will look at this poster and think, what will I tell my children when I grow up? Will I tell them I did play a role in the war? Did I tell them that I was a hero? Or will I tell them that I was a coward, that I didn't sign up? Now of course that's not true either way, but this is what the posters were supposed to make men feel. It's supposed to make men worry about whether they will have to tell their children, I did nothing in the war, I didn't go. And then the children, who as you can see, seem to look favourably upon those who are part of the military and have fought in the Great War, the children might be quite disappointed. Oh, well, everybody else on the street, for example, their fathers went to war. And again, it will make the children feel disappointed. Now, remember guys, this isn't the reality. This is just what the propaganda wanted men to think. It wanted them to feel like they were going to grow up and disappoint their children if they didn't sign up, and be able to tell them about the heroic stories that they did do as they were part of the army. So that's number 1. What I'd like you to do is think about what is the message in number 2 and number 3, and write down on your piece of paper or in your books what that message is. Here's our second example of what the government did to try and encourage men to sign up to the war. Your new subheading is going to be Stories of German Cruelty. Now, essentially, guys, the government embedded stories of German cruelty into regular news. And what that did is it had an impact on the way that men in England felt about German soldiers. Let's have a look at some examples and I'll explain that a bit further. So during the First World War, most countries publicised stories of enemy soldiers committing atrocities. Now, it was believed at the time that this would help young men to join the armed forces. And I'll talk to you a bit more about why in a minute. As one British general pointed out after the war, to make armies go on killing one another, it is necessary to invent lies about the enemy. Interesting. These atrocity stories were then fed into British newspapers, who were quite willing to publish them. British newspapers then accused German soldiers of a series of crimes, including, listen to some of these stories. So in British newspapers, they talked about German soldiers gouging out the eyes of civilians, that means people that are not involved in the war, cutting off the hands of teenage boys, giving children hand grenades to play with, bayoneting babies, and the crucifixion of captured soldiers. There was even a story in the Times newspaper which told of German soldiers boiling dead bodies and turning them into soap. Now, of course, there are definitely some examples during the First World War of different military soldiers from different nations, including Germany, that would have committed some sort of atrocities to civilians at some point. There are definitely examples of that. But for them to be on such a wide range and a large scale here, it has been exploited and it has been exaggerated for the purpose of making British men hate German soldiers. Because essentially, as it states in the second bullet point, to make armies go on killing one another, it is necessary to invent lies about the enemy. It was important to make the soldiers look like monsters, to dehumanise them in a way, because remember that the men signing up to fight would have to kill these men. And it would be easier for them to do that if they saw them as men that did perform things like giving children hand grenades or bayoneting a baby. That means to stab a baby, essentially. So it would be easier for the British men to feel like they could harm these German men if they felt they had done those things. Whereas if you were to look at those German men and see them as fathers, brothers, sons, innocent men, it makes it much more difficult to kill them, doesn't it? So the idea is that these stories were leaked into British newspapers to make people hate the Germans and to make it easier to fight them. Make sure you've written down some examples of stories of German cruelty. The next example we're going to be looking at is called PALS battalions. You may or may not have heard of these before. Now, PALS battalions were actually a British phenomenon. Now, that means that it's something that the British government introduced to try and get more men to sign up. Now, Britain actually was one of the only countries, in fact, the only major power, to not start the First World War with mass conscription. Other countries conscripted men straight away, forcing them to sign up, but Britain didn't. Britain asked men to volunteer for the first 2 years. So what that meant is that because we had quite a small army in this country, essentially it wasn't big enough for global conflict as we know, and that's why propaganda posters were created to try and encourage men to sign up. But what the government realised is that actually many more men would sign up if they could serve alongside their friends, their relatives and their workmates. This is what the PALS battalions is all about. A battalion is a group of soldiers. So basically, what the government decided is that what they were going to do is set up these PALS battalions where essentially men from the same communities, that means like they might be the same men on a football team, they might be from, the same community in terms of they might live in the same village. They might even be people that are genuine friends. A big group of friends might all sign up to the same battalion. Now, obviously, yes, that would encourage more men to sign up because they're going to sign up with their mates. They might feel like it's much more less threatening. They might feel more comfortable if they were going to go to a foreign country and fight in a war, and they were going to do it alongside their brothers and their cousins and their friends, their football team. They might feel more secure doing that if they had the support of those men alongside them. So after training, the first PALS battalion began to arrive on the Western Front in the mid-1915. However, many of the PALS battalions were not to see their first major action until the first day of the Battle of Somme in 1916. Now, the problem for this, the Battle of Somme was a bloody battle. On the first day, 20,000 men died. So that means that many of these PALS battalion units sustained heavy casualties, which of course had a massive impact on their communities. With the introduction of conscription, this close-knit nature of PALS battalions was never to be replicated. But at the beginning of the war, although it encouraged more men to sign up, it was definitely a big problem. Let's look at this example from Lancashire, where a PALS battalion group of around 700 men from Lancashire all joined up together. They were all from a small town, and basically the people in the town were so proud of them for going off. 15,000 men in their town gathered in the streets. 15,000 people, not men, people, women, children, everybody, gathered in the streets and waved flags and cheered at these men for going off to war. But as we mentioned, their first day was the Battle of the Somme. And in 20 minutes, 235 of these men that were from this Lancashire town, they were called the Accrington Pals, and they were all killed, 235 of them in 20 minutes. Over 350 of them were also wounded. So everybody in Accrington was shocked and sad. In some families, all of the men died on the same day. Can you imagine the impact on that community? If all of those young men from the same town all died on that day. The mourning and the loss and the grief that would occur in that town would be really, really difficult to handle for those people at home. But the government used this as a system to get men to sign up, because more men would go if they were going with their friends or their family. I'd now like you to go off and find out a bit more about the PALS battalions by watching a video. The link is on Show My Homework, and once you've watched it, I'd like you to come back to this video to continue the lesson. Okay, Year 8, our final section that we're going to be looking at is the threat of shame and the white feathers. This is your fourth subheading, so you can make sure you've got that down. And we're going to talk about what the white feathers were all about, what was their meaning, and we're going to be talking about how they were used to encourage men to fight in the war. So a white feather was typically handed out by young women to young men, and these were men who had not signed up to basically fight in the First World War. The white feather was used as a symbol to mean a man was a coward. So when women basically attached a feather to a man's jacket like this one here in this picture, they were saying to him, you're a coward, you've not signed up, basically you're not a real man, okay? And ultimately, these were presented to anybody that was not in uniform. So that could even mean a soldier off duty that came home. Even there are some examples of them receiving feathers too. Now, upon receipt of this white feather, these men were being told that they weren't real men, and that women around them looked upon them in disgust because of their lack of masculinity. This, of course, was a real issue. At this time, particularly, it was very difficult for men to have their masculinity questioned, and for women to go around shaming men and, humiliating and saying that they weren't real men and they were cowards. That was really quite shaming to a man at that time, and it was something that men found really humiliating, and it would come back to their families if they were in a tight-knit community as well. Now, the idea of this was to shame a man into joining the army. Okay, to make him feel so embarrassed that he hadn't done so already, that he had to do so now. And once people heard about these feathers, more men would possibly sign up because they were afraid it would happen to them too. So even if a man hadn't personally received a white feather, he might have heard of somebody in his community that had, and he didn't also want to receive the same treatment, and that would ultimately force him to sign up and fight as well. So there is an example of this being used, and although this wasn't necessarily enforced by the government, it is something that society did to push upon men to basically fight in the First World War. So there are 4 different reasons for why men were forced to sign up at a time of voluntary recruitment. Well done for making of your notes today, Year 8. And what I'd like to now do is to decide which of these methods that we've looked at today do you think would be the most effective in getting more men to sign up to the armed forces in World War I. And I do want you to explain your reasoning as well. So here's the 4 that you can choose from. Propaganda posters, stories of German cruelty, the PALS battalions, or the threat of shame. Which one of those methods do you think would be the best at getting men to sign up? Which one do you think would be the most effective? Now, this is your opinion. You might even want to consider which one you might be more persuaded by. But also, do think about the contemporaries, people at the time, and how they might have felt. Now, once you've written your answer as a short paragraph in your books or on your piece of paper, can you please share your answer with your teacher on Teams during the plenary in the last 5 minutes of the lesson, so that your teacher can find out what your opinions are and how well you've understood the knowledge from today's lesson. Now, that brings us to the end of our video, guys. So thank you so much for listening, and take care.